Okay, let's dive in. Today, we're really unpacking IELTS preparation,
Mm,
and we're working from a really interesting student guide that was put together specifically to help test takers.
that's right. And our goal here, our mission for this deep dive, is basically to pull out the key stuff, the most important tips and, strategies from this guide.
Exactly. We want to help you understand how IELTS works and, crucially, how to prep for it effectively based just on what this source tells us.
And it's worth noting the guide does focus mostly on the academic test. That's the one usually needed for university.
Right, but it also says, and this is important, a lot of the advice is actually super useful for the general training test, too. So stick around, even if that's your goal.
Definitely. So, where does the guide suggest we start? Well, fundamentally understanding the test itself.
Makes sense.
It confirms, the two types we just mentioned,
Yeah.
academic and general training. And it breaks down the four sections.
Yeah, the classic four: listening, reading, speaking, and writing.
Yeah.
No big surprises there.
No, but the guide really clarifies the scoring, which is, well, it's essential. Each of those sections gets its own band score, usually 0 to 9.
Okay.
And your final overall score, it's not just pass-fail, it's actually the average of those four scores.
Ah, right. And the guide gives an example, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That makes it much clearer. If you got, say, a 7 in listening,
An 8 in writing, 7 in speaking, and maybe a 6 in writing. Yeah.
then you add them up: 7 plus 8 plus 7 plus 6, that's 28.
Exactly. Divide by 4, and you get band 7 overall. It's pure math, a straight average. So every section really does count.
That example makes it click.
Yeah.
And it also gives some context on, like, typical scores, right?
It does. It mentions the average score worldwide tends to float around 6.5 to 6.75. And interestingly, that average can actually vary a bit depending on where you take the test.
Huh, didn't know that.
What else?
Oh, the CFR levels.
Yes. This is fascinating. The resource links the IELTS bands to the Common European Framework of Reference, the CEFR,
Mhm.
which gives you that, international benchmark.
So you know what your score actually means in terms of fluency.
Precisely. The guide points out that a C1 level, that's often seen as advanced, generally lines up with IELTS scores between 7 and 8.5.
Okay, and what about B2? That's upper intermediate.
Yeah, independent user level. That, according to the guide, maps roughly to IELTS 5.5 up to 6.5. So knowing this helps set realistic targets.
Definitely. So moving on from what the test is, how does the guide suggest we actually prepare?
Right, the how. It offers some really key insights here. One big one is that the effort required to improve your score, it gets disproportionately harder the higher you go.
Okay, unpack that. So, like, going from band 6 to 6.5 takes a certain amount of work, but getting from 7 to 7.5 could take way more effort, like double or triple.
That's the idea presented, yeah. Progress isn't linear, especially at those higher bands where small improvements require a lot more refinement.
That's really important for managing expectations.
Absolutely. And building on that, the guide says the very first step for anyone preparing should be twofold. First, really understand your current English level accurately. And second, understand exactly what the IELTS examiners are looking for at each specific score level, the criteria.
So it's not just about general English skill, it's about hitting those specific test requirements.
That's exactly it. The guide actually states that knowing those specific band descriptors, what the examiners need to see and hear, is worth at least half a point.
Wow, okay. That's a big claim. Worth looking into those rubrics then.
Definitely. Another useful distinction the guide makes is between the types of skills tested.
Right, listening and reading versus speaking and writing.
Exactly. Listening and reading are about receiving English, understanding input. But speaking and writing, those are about producing English yourself, actively creating language.
And why is that distinction important for prep?
Because, the guide suggests, your study time should reflect where you need the most work. If your speaking and writing are lower, those productive skills probably need more of your focus, more hours.
Which leads to something the guide really hammers home: the need for actual practice, especially for speaking and writing.
Yes. And ideally, practice under exam-like conditions.
Right.
What the material really emphasizes is that just knowing grammar rules or vocab lists, well, it doesn't automatically mean you can produce fluent, accurate English when you're under pressure.
You have to actually do it.
You have to do it. And the guide points out that doing it effectively often requires feedback,
Yeah,
marking, guidance, someone pointing out the errors you might not even notice yourself.
that makes sense. It also mentions planning, right? Like having a structured plan.
Very strongly. It advocates for a detailed study plan that covers not just the four main skills, but also dedicated time for grammar and vocabulary, because those underpin everything.
So the plan isn't just, I'll study IELTS, it's much more specific.
Exactly. And then it looks at how to study. It suggests a blended approach is often best, not just relying on one textbook.
Mixing it up.
Yeah, using books, websites, YouTube channels, apps, maybe even podcasts like this one.
Well, there you go. And it encourages experimenting, too.
It does. Things like recording your voice when you practice speaking, playing word games for vocab, doing online grammar quizzes, listening actively to podcasts, trying new things.
Sounds more engaging than just hitting the books.
It can be. But the guide also makes a really important point about studying alone.
Which is?
That for many people, preparing effectively entirely on their own is, well, it's really tough. Without some kind of external feedback or guidance, it's hard to spot your own weaknesses, stay motivated, and, reach your full potential.
Right, so that's where support comes in, like tutors.
Exactly. The guide highlights a knowledgeable tutor as a potentially huge asset, especially for planning, and maybe most importantly, for improving those production skills, speaking and writing.
And it mentions they're particularly helpful for long-standing mistakes.
Yes, those ingrained errors that are hard to self-correct. A good tutor can spot those and help you fix them. That's what the source suggests.
Okay. What about practice partners? Does it mention them?
It does, yeah. It says they can be effective, but with some caveats.
Like what?
Well, you need to be at a similar level, have the same goals for the practice sessions, and both need to be reliable and organized. It's not just a casual chat. It needs structure to work well, according to this guide.
Makes sense. Needs commitment. Now, resources. The guide lists categories, right?
It mentions several categories: websites, YouTube channels, apps, podcasts, and even Facebook groups. And it notes that the original handout linked to lots of free resources.
Any specific recommendations highlighted?
Just one is singled out with a specific positive comment. For YouTube, it explicitly calls out the channel IELTS Liz as being very good.
Good to know. IELTS Liz. Okay. And finally, it seems the guide doesn't just stop at studying. It talks about test day itself.
That's right. It references links providing practical tips for the day before the exam and the actual test day, managing nerves, logistics, that kind of thing.
And the computer versus paper choice.
Yes, it touches on that too. It mentions resources that discuss how the computer-delivered IELTS works and compare the pros and cons with the paper-based test. That's a key decision for test takers now.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. If we distill the main takeaways from this guide for you, the listener, what are they?
Well, first, really understand the scoring and the test format. Second, know your starting level and exactly what the exam demands at your target score.
Third, focus your practice, maybe disproportionately, on the production skills, speaking and writing if they need work.
Fourth, use a mix of resources, that blended learning idea. Don't just stick to one thing. Fifth, make a detailed plan covering everything, including grammar and vocab.
And finally, maybe the most crucial according to this guide, seek out feedback. Whether it's a tutor or a well-structured practice partnership, you need external input to spot your blind spots.
Yeah, that seems to be the core message. This dive into the guide should give you a pretty solid roadmap for how to approach your TREP.
And that leads us to a final thought, something this guide kind of implies. There are tons of free resources out there, which is great. But the guide strongly suggests that without specific targeted feedback, the kind that helps you see and correct your own persistent errors, those free materials alone might only get you so far.
Right. Which leaves you with a question to ponder for your own IELTS journey. How are you going to make sure you get the personalized feedback needed to break through your plateaus, overcome those blind spots, and really hit your highest possible score?
Something definitely worth thinking about as you plan your next steps.